and we can. Oh, let me share screen. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the you should know that the way the Mamorim were written, I don't think I mentioned it. Maybe I did. I don't think I mentioned it though. The way the Mamorim were written, they were written sort of as a hemshech, and then the beginning and end was added later on. In other words, to break it into Mamorim, the fee, the parsha
Hmm.
was that was added later on by the Rebbe Rashab.
Uh-huh.
So the Inyan is a hemshech Inyan. It's like that's the way it was written. It wasn't written to feed the parsha so much. In any event,
Right. And when we learn it, it doesn't feel like it talks about the Parsha. It's basically some very deep idea which continues across several memoriam, but the sort of beginning and the end seems like the sort of tied to the Parsha, but basically then they sort of dissolve.
yeah, right, yeah, that's exactly correct, and that's the reason. Okay, so we'll start off with a new mimer. This is Parshas Balak, and we're just about to. We'll get to Perek Chavtes shortly, but just the beginning of the mimer. Mi mana afar Yaakov, mispar is Reva Yisrael. This is in Parshas Balak, and one of the brachas, so to speak, that Bilam gives to the Jewish people. And there's a number of ways of touching this pasuk. We'll just touch it out first simply, and then we'll see other ways of touching it out. Perhaps mi mana afra Yaakov, who can count the dust of Yaakov, who can count the dust of Yaakov. In other words, Yaakov is like the dust, ka'afa aretz, and therefore it's found everywhere. Umispar is Roiva Yisrael, and count Roiva Yisrael. Roiva could be touched as a quarter, like 25%, Roiva Yisrael. But depending on how we actually touch this whole thing out, it could also be, Rashi explains, Revio Sehem Shel Yisrael, who could count the amount of um, how do you say it? Copulation. That's not the right word. Intimacy. When intimacy of Bnei Israel and their wives, and the zera that is produced thereby. Okay, that's what's called roiva. Reviosayin, reviasayin shel Bnei Israel. In other words, their sexual connection, intercourse. Okay, that's the simple touch of the pasuk, and the Rebbe asked the following question. We have to understand Pirushu Mispar is Reva Yisrael. We have to understand what it means. Mispar is Reva Yisrael. Are we saying this is the to count a quarter of Israel? So if you say there's a quarter of Israel, obviously um, the simple meaning is that there is a quarter. In other words, there's a limited number, and you can count a quarter, which is why Rashi does not touch it that way, because he holds that it can't be counted. Bnei Yisrael can't be counted. Anyway, he'll explain now. Mispar is roiva Israel. Im hakavona sheyesh mispar is the intention that there is a mispar, and this is the quarter of the mispar, or shekayel mashakasu mimana, or does it refer to what it says in the beginning of the pasuk, mimana, who can count, not who does count, but who can count. In other words, uncountable. The Hainu Shelo Yesh Mispar. In other words, there's no limitation to the Mispar of Bnei Israel, or Revi Yosem Shel Israel, as Rashi says. Okay, these questions we're going to not address until right at the end of the Maimer. So let's continue. V'gam halo Yisrael hu lomanu medregas Yaakov. Another question that we have on this pasuk is Yisrael is always traditionally above it's a higher shame than the shame Yaakov. Yaakov Yud Akev. It's the madrega of Yud that comes down to the Akev. Masha Enkan Yisrael is Shir Kel or Yashar Kel. There are different ways of explaining it, but Yisrael is definitely the name that was given to Yaakov only after he struggled with the Elokim and Hashem Batuchal, right? He struggled with the angels and so on, and only afterwards was he given this new name, this because it was a new Matthias, a higher Matthias than he had before. So, V'agamalu Yisrael hu lamaila mimadregas Yaakov kiyadua. V'lama gabi Yaakov ne'emar, and therefore the question arises: why does it say the gabi Yaakov ne'emar mimana? Who can count? Who can count? Who could possibly count? The pshata pashatu shelo yesh mispar, that there's no possibility of mispar. Who could count? V'gabi Yisrael ksiv mispar, but by Israel it's written mispar. You would think it would be the other way around. Now, as explained before, it could be that mispar, when it says when mispar is mispar is Reva Yisrael, that could be also refer to mimana, so it would also be impossible to count. But that doesn't seem to be the pasha of pshat. The word mispar is used by Bnei Israel, and lo mispar by Yaakov. Why should that be? Should there be that difference? L'chorah should be the other way around. Having calls it to understand all of these questions. We have to explain what we discussed in the last Maimah. The hamshochas ha'oiris, the esesphiris, the atzilus, mishorsham, nekoiram. The hamshocha of the esesphiris hagluyos, the esesphiris in atzilus, from the shorish makor. What's the shorish makor of the esesphiris of atzilus? The esesphiris hagnuzois, shain esesphiris hagnuzois. These are in atzilus hagluyos, the revealed spherois, and in the shorish makor esesphiris hagnuzois davka. Bor Ein Sof Hu Al Yidei Tzimtzum. So these galus of the Esses Spiritus Atzilus are via Tzimtzum. Nizboy, we explained previously, Sheyesh Bazeh Shnei Tzimtzumim. In fact, there's not just one Tzimtzum, there's two Tzimtzumim. Ha'alef HaTzimtzum HaOr Shebechinas Ein Sof, SheHaTzimtzum Hazeh Hu Bechinas Siluk Chulem. The higher, the first level of Tzimtzum, Tzimtzum HaRishon, is called Bechinas Siluk. In other words, the Or had to be Nistalik, had to be removed to a Madrega that is Lamaila, Miha Or Hashayach Lo'olemis, because we're talking here about the inyan of the Or Hashayach Lo'olemis. That's where the Tzimtzum was. It wasn't in the Madregas higher than that. And that Or had to be removed from its Shaychus to Oilemis in order for it to actually be Oilemis. And then it had to be Nimshach afterwards via the Kav. So that was the Tzimtzum HaRishon, B'chinas Siluk. That was the first Tzimtzum. V'habei is the second Tzimtzum, HaTzimtzum B'shosha HaOiris. These are the Tzimtzum in the roots of the Oir. In other words, this is a Tzimtzum not B'chinas Siluk, but B'chinas Mi'ut, a reduction of the Oir. B'shosha HaOiris, Kamosh Kluli Bor Ein Sof Baruch Hu, as the Oirs are included in the Or HaShayach L'Oilemis, which is the Esses V'Yisak Nuzos essentially. Heim B'chinas Ta'aruves V'Yis Achdus, Shegevoyim B'Ma'alosam Be'etzem. These are in a state of being all mixed together, in a state of oneness, a state of unity, and on such a high level that they can't actually be counted as 10 individual spheroids, even though there are 10 individual spheroids, but they all seem to be one thing. They all merge into one Indian. We could say possibly like the Indian of a Mishnah or the Indian even of a Pasuk. The Indian of a Mishnah is that the number of sphoras that are shaykh in that particular Mishnah. As we see in the Gemara, there could be a number of different sphoras that come out of, that interpret the Mishnah differently. The Mishnah itself bears all of those sphoras. All of those sphoras are merumas in the Mishnah. And necessarily so, because that's the whole intention, that there could be a remiss to all these different sphoras in the Mishnah that come out in the Gemara. All of them are merumas in the Mishnah. And similarly with the Ora Ein Sof, the Esesris Agnuzas and Ora Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum had in it all these possible sphoras, just like in other words, all these possible oiros, just like the Mishnah contains all these different sphoras. But they're bechinas achdus in the Mishnah. That's one Mishnah and not 10 different svaras in the Mishnah, so to speak. That only comes out later on in the Gemara. Betimtu. So again, I'm bechinas his arus his achdus shegevoim b'ma'alas and be'etzim she'enam bechinas mitzius nikeres. They can be recognized individually as individual spheroids, etc. V'gam me'behem or naile. In addition, there's an or naile, in other words, an or ha'oila al kulono, as we explained in the previous Maimorim, that when there's his achdus of the spheroids b'yachad, there's an oir that surpasses all of them, transcends all of them, that is ma'ached them and shines down on them, so to speak, and keeps them as a single unit. So that's the or hameir b'hem or nale shia kavona ha'elyon shebinyan spheroids. The intention of those spheroids is what keeps them together, and when that is taken away, then the spheres can be, when that is reduced rather, then the spheres can be revealed individually as individual spheroids, chokhmah, bina, and so on and so forth. Vatzimtzum, in other words, the second symptom, hu shenifretu liyos nimshach sphera achas pratius, that one sphere, one individual sphere, could be nimshach at a time, or this causes the or to be reduced because you don't have the or ha'oila al kulono, since they're only coming out now individually. And they can be now recognizable as individual entities. This is chokhmah, this is bina, this is chesed, this is gvura, etc.
So, Rav Milrov, there is no one else besides me in the class, correct?
I don't
Right
know.
now.
I don't know. I think Adam is in the class. I don't know. Adam and Eliezer. I don't know. I don't know if they've just put their cameras on and they're not there. I don't know.
Okay, because I just want to ask the question, but if there are other people, I don't want to interrupt the class.
Eliezer's there. Yeah.
We're all here. We're all here.
Okay.
All right.
We're all here.
Ask the question anyway, quickly, and then we'll see.
Okay, so when we say that all 10 spheres are like in one, do they, this inclusion is at the level when their names are not exist even, or it's sort of, we recognize that there are 10 of them, but we cannot distinguish between them?
Yeah, we cannot.
Not even the
we know
names.
that there are 10, but we cannot distinguish. Yeah.
Okay.
It says in others for him, he doesn't bring it here, but it says in others for him that we only know sort of ex post facto, you know what I mean? Only after the fact, only after they come out as esespherois, agluyois, do we know that their shoirish is esespherois. There must be esespherois. But the way it looks to us from down below is that there's only one oir over there. There's only one oir.
Okay.
And it's not... and
okay,
it's not
so
divided
we
into
don't
10.
see chokhmah, we just see or, we don't distinguish, we don't know
Right.
what the components are.
Right. But al derech dugma, light that goes in before it goes into a prism. We only see
Right.
like it's only white light, right? But when it goes through the prism, then you see that there's afterwards that there's, but that's a mute in the ore. That inyan is memayat the ore so that it comes out in different colors. Okay, Choftes. Well, pian al yuvan, according to what we said now, we understand inyan is lapshus ores bekalim. This is a subject that we started talking about already, I think, in Perik Yudalid. It's quite a long way before this particular mimer. So it's talking about the inyan of hislapshus ha'oires bekalim. There's two inyonim in hislapshus ha'oires bekalim. First of all, that the or is melubash primarily in the pnimius hakli and not in the chitzonius hakli. In order for it to pass from the pnimius hakli to the chitzonius hakli, it also goes through a tzimtzum. But the or itself is mulumash in the pnimius hakli. And what or is mulumash in the pnimius hakli? The chitzonius or, right? The chitzonius or is mulumash in pnimius hakli. So we can see that that there's there has to be a certain process over here. The pnimius or cannot be mulubash in the kli because the kli is not refined enough to be able to makabel. The only place that it is malubash that way is in Keser, and that's the reason for that is that Keser essentially doesn't have a chitzonius. Apalpi that there's more than one madrega in Keser. There's Arich and there's Atik and so on, and Raglo. Nevertheless, you can't call Arich the chitzonius really of. It's not a kli per se, right? It's makabel or, but it's not a kli in the same way that chokhmah is a kli. Reish is chokhmah because it's the first kli. All right, in any event, we'll get there and we'll explain a little bit further as we continue. So, Yuvan inyan slapshus oiris bekalim, shara oiris v'kalim, richuk ha'erech. There's a distance between them. not just the distance between them, but a large distance between the richuk ha'erech, ze mizeh. K'mo haguf ha'nefesh, just like the guf and the nefesh, which are berichuk ha'erech, sherachoik erka ma'oid, sha'nefesh ruchni, v'aguf chumri v'gashmi. This should read chumri, not choimer, but chumri v'gashmi chulu. Printer's error probably. So again, there's a richuk between the guf and the nefesh. Similarly, there's a richuk between the oris and the kalim. More can be dugma kazois, and the oris v'kalim. Kamaimer become a gufin tekinas loin, as it says in Pasach Eliyahu, that gufim tekinas loin, you prepared gufim for the oiros. In other words, gufim means the kalim, right? The kalim are what are makabel the oiros, just like the guf is makabel the neshama. It's an exact parallel. Nevertheless, even though there's a richuk ha'erech between them, nevertheless the oira is coming to islapshus in the kalim, and it's mamish islapshus. It's not just a dimion of islapshus. It's mamish islapshus. In other words, what's the difference between let's use the word hashroa and islapshus? Actually, there's one of the fundamental inyonim in the Torah of Baal Shem Tov is understanding the distinction between hislapshus. There's actually three madrigas: hishtalshlus, hislapshus, and hashroa. Those are three madrigas milamata lamayla. Hishtalshlus is the lowest madriga. That's developmental, right? The development of madrigas from as they mishtalshel downwards. That's hishtalshlus. Hislapshus is the slapshus of oiros in kalim. In other words, before there's any hishtalshlus, but just the connection of oiros to kalim. And then there's a madrega called hashra'a, is the oir that's lamayla mihakli, that cannot be melubash or is not melubash in the kli. Very important things in the Torah of Baal Shem Tov, and this is one of the things that distinguishes the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov from the teachings of the Arizal, because the Baal Shem Tov looks at these three inyonim, which he also calls oilemus, neshamois, and elokus. Oilemus is the inyan of ishtalshalus, neshamois is the inyan of islapshus. Islapshus or in sof in the neshama, and hashra'a is the inyan of etzem elokus. That's lamalam islapshus in the neshama, and is only mizgale in the madrega of yichida or afilu lamalam yichida. It's the nitzutz boire. In any event, so just to point out that that's an important thing. The oil is coming to Islavshus Bekalim, and Islavshus Mamash. The Kli is Mamash Toifes the Or, and the Or is Mamash Malubash in the Kli, to the extent that the Kli limits the Or to a certain extent. The Or is Machaya the Kli, and the Kli limits the Or. And why is that? How could that be if they berichu ka'erech? V'hu mipnei she'ba'oiros yesh gam ken she'ba'oiros gam k'mo she'hein b'shorshan. The oiros as they are, even as they are in their source, b'shorshan makoiran b'or en sof harim b'chinas eses spherois. They are nevertheless eses spherois. These again are the eses spherois agnuzos. Since there's an union of eses spherois agnuzos, even though it's not nikar yet that there's eses spherois agnuzos, because it all looks like one, or it's all behis achtus betaruvois, behis arvus. Nevertheless, there are eses spherois. And what are these Inyan, and what's the Inyan of these eses spherois? It's the Inyan, to use another moshel. Before we said it's the Inyan of the Tziur HaOr, that there's a Tziur in the oiros before even before the Tzimtzum. Why? Because it's the Or that's shaykh to the oilemus. Here he used a different terminology, and this is the terminology which is used more in the Mitzvah Rebbe's Shara Yichud. But in any event, he explains it like this: "V'hu bebechinas alos haratzon." You have the inyan of alos haratzon lo oilemis, and therefore there's a tziur to the ratzon. That's the same as the inyan of the eses spherois agnuzois. It's the tziur of the ratzon that causes there to be eser. Hu b'chinas alos haratzon shu inyan hashora laha'ir b'mida ugvul. He's meshar b'toch atzmus, so he measures out in himself, so to speak, how he is going to in the future after the tzimtzum illuminate in a measured and limited way, but it's still only going on in himself. The usual marshal that's given for this is when a person is about to give a speech. He's going to give a speech, so he prepares himself and he thinks in his own mind beforehand, before he actually gives the speech, what he's going to say and how he's going to deliver it. But because it's bebechinas machshova adayin, so it doesn't come out as words per se. He's got like a general idea of what he's going to talk about, but exactly the words that he's going to use, he doesn't even think about yet. But he knows the nakudas that he wants to give over in his speech, if his speech is masuder and organized, which may not always be the case, but in any event, that's the moshel that's used to explain this in of hashora. Hashora lahayir b'midu gvul. He's going to speak in measured words and oisius, this inyan as it is in his machshova. So to continue, the imi yois shehen b'chinas tachlis ha'isachtus, that even though they're in a state of his achdus, as they are in machshova, as they are in ratzoin, the Hashem b'chinas pshitus. In other words, they can't really be measured because they're b'chinas pshitus. Acha enu b'chinas nikeres la'atzman klal, they're not recognizable on their own. Mikol makom harem b'chinas eses tfiros al kopanim, but nevertheless, there are eses tfiros. There is a tziyur in the oir. There is a tziyur in the ratzoin, and that's called eses tfiros al gnuzos. Okay, I was actually going to skip this bracket and finish the idea, the thought before we continued in the bracket, but now that we're here, I might as well just continue. Okay. And the way that they are nimshach, the way they're nimshach and they become izgale, who they are tzimtzum, is by way of the tzimtzum. What does that mean? Which tzimtzum are we talking about? The second tzimtzum, not the first tzimtzum. Well, they are tzimtzum, hanish nimshach sfira pratius, bifnei atzmai. And then it becomes a recognizable thing. The moshel that we used previously was like the letter base from the word Baruch, right? The letter base is recognized now on its own, not as a whole concept of Baruch, but as an individual letter. And therefore can be melubash in the kalim. Oh no, it wasn't here that there was going to be, that I was going to make a. It's a little bit different in the Sefer, I think. Yeah, it's over here. Yeah. Okay. Chulu. Okay. These are the kalim which are bechinas elokus be'etzem. What do we mean? What do we mean to say when they're bechinas elokus be'etzem? Here we're talking about the kalim of olam hatzilus. We're not talking about kalim of olam biyah. The kalim of eloku of atzilus are kalim of elokus. Of course, kalim lamali mi atzilus. In other words, the kalim of ak. But I feel the kalim of atzilus, about which it says iwa chayoyi chad bohoin, iwa garmoyi chad bohoin. Right? Iwa chayoyi is the oiros, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya Geras HaKodesh Perek Chof, that the kalim the oiros are bechinas achdus. Iwa chayoyi, the oiros of bechinas achdus chad bohoin. Iwa chayoyi, iwa garmoyi rather chad bohoin, and he and his activities, causations, i.e. the kalim, are also chad, with he's one with them. Why? Because the elokus be'etzem, masha ein kain, the kalim of bria already b'chinas yesh, the kalim of atzilus b'chinas bittul, b'chinas garmoi. Okay, so han b'kalim shein gam ken elokus be'etzem chur, v'gam she'atzimtzum b'chinas miyut levad. And even though the tzimtzum is only, this tzimtzum is only a bechina of miut and not a bechina of siluk, because that's the first tzimtzum. The tzimtzum we're talking about is the second tzimtzum. The inyan of miut bechinas gilu emir helem. The inyan of tzimtzum is the gilu hahelem. In other words, what is the tzimtzum the second symptom bring about? The symptom in the Shosha Oiris, what does that bring about? That was what was Behelem, Bebechinas Spheres Hagnuzois, now comes the Spheres Hagluyois. That's called Giloi Me'ahelem. It was Ganus before, and now it's Begiloi. Giloi Ahelem. Now we're going to skip the brackets, and then we'll come back to it in a minute. And he says, "V'chol giloi me'ahelem hare hagiloi me'ein ahelem." Any concept of something that's mizgala me'ahelem, like the esesurius hagluyois, or mizgala from the esesurius hagnuzois, what's mizgala is ka'ein masha haya behelem. What's revealed is what was like, what was there in the Orient Sof before the second Tzimtzum, and it's ma'ain, it's like what was there behelem. In other words, there's a kesher between the Eses Tridus Agnuzois and the Eses Tridus Agnuzois in Agluois in Atzilus. Again, between the Eses Tridus Agnuzois before the second Tzimtzum and the Eses Tridus Agluois as they are in Atzilus. Okay. We'll just continue until the period. Just as the oil in its state of pshitus, in other words, the esespheres agnuzes, which again, these esespheres are esespheres in the oil, not in the kalim, according to this shita. The esespheres in the oil, which the esespheres agnuzes, were in a state of pshitus, in other words, couldn't be described or measured, etc. Therefore, when they come out into Giloi, they're also in a state of pshitus. They're in a state of pshitus until they are become mugbal by the kalim, which we'll see shortly. We'll see later on. Okay, let's go back now to before the to the what it said in the bracket. So we said before the bracket that the union of mute is bechinas gilui me'ahelem, right? So he explains what this is. V'zeu hafresh ben mute lesiluk. This is the difference between the two timtzumim. This timtzum is a timtzum of mute. It's only a reduction. It's only a narrowing down of the oil. Masha Einkain, the first Tzimtzum was the Tzimtzum B'derech Siluk. And the difference is as follows. Zeu hefresh ben miut the Siluk. The miut, Husham Shochu Be'erech, Shorsha Makoira. That when it comes to miut, it's only a reduction of what was there before. Before it was Behispashtus, and now it's B'miut. It's now B'tzimtzum. Right? But it's nevertheless the same inyan of oil. Just as you would say, if you take a whole ray of sun or the rays of the sun and you take one photon is not b'mehus different than a whole ray of the sun or all the rays of the sun, right? This is a single photon, and that's billions and billions of photons or trillions of photons, but they're still the same mehus. So the Indian of mute is a mute in eichus. I'm sorry, it's a mute in kamus, not a mute in eichus. It's a mute in metzius. It's not a mute in muhus, right? Mute in muhus is the first tzimtzum. Mute in eichus is the first tzimtzum. A mute in kamus in amount is the second tzimtzum. A mute b'metzius in the existence of the thing. Okay. Again, the mute who am shocha who be'erech shoshem akoira. Afal that is a mute. Nevertheless, what's nimshach has an erech to what is before, what it was in its makor. With siluk hu ba'ein aroch ukamo hischachus. Mash enkein siluk. What comes out afterwards is yesh mi'ayin. It's hischachus. It's a new thing. You can't say that it was there before in its makor. And even that, even the symptom Marishan is not Yitzchachus Mamish. Why? Because the ore that was the ore that came out afterwards and was nevertheless remained davuk in its makor, because otherwise it would not be or ein sof. The kav is nevertheless or ein sof. Right? Avop that the kav is a kav Yashar, and it goes milamala lamata, and it's a kavdak, and so on, right? A very thin kav. Nevertheless, it's davuk b'makoiroi. It's attached to its makor at the top, and therefore it's not mamish yesh ayin. You can't say that the kav is yesh ayin. Where is the in of yesh ayin? In the kalim dafka, not in the oir. The oir is nevertheless ha'or hu ma'en ha'ma'or. The oir, even if it's the oir of the kav, is ma'en ha'ma'or. It's like the ma'or in that it's has this quality of ein sofiyut, of infinity to it. Masha ein kan the kalim is chachus mamish. But is chachus mamish shaykh rak b'metzius dava kamo kama b'kalim chulu. His chachus really is only shaykh to kalim. Okay, so now we continue.
Rabbi Miller, just one question, a little bit on the side. There is also concept of parsa,
Yeah,
right? How does it relate to any of those, or it's not related at all?
it's related, but only later on in later on in Madregas Vishtoshlos later on, because the parasa, there's no parasa at this point in time. It depends on where you're talking about, but in Ak there is a parasa, but that's already after the Tzimtzum. In Ak there's a parasa, and there's a parasa between Atzilus and Bria, because in Atzilus is still Elokus, and Bria is already is Chachus.
So, but what does parsa do, and is it a bigger concealment or a smaller? How is it relate? How does it relate to those concepts?
It's a different kind of concealment. It's a concealment mamish. Masha Einkain, what we're saying here is not a concealment mamish. It's more of a how shall we say it? It's more of just bringing out what was implicit in the Inyonim Lamaila, are brought out into Giloi Lamata. But the parasa has to do with the Inyan of Kalim. And as we'll see, he's going to speak about parasa in another couple of Maimorim, if I remember correctly. Another couple of Maimorim later on, he's going to speak about the Inyan Pasos. But at this point in time, we're not talking about parasa. Parasa is a mute, and it also makes the kli into a metzius yesh, much more yesh than even yesh mi'ayin, because the yesh mi'ayin is already a yesh that is related to the ayin, but it's a dakustika yesh. The parasa makes into a yesh gashmi, a yesh chumri. All right, we'll get that later on. In any event, as we said before, as we said, we already explained this. And therefore, the oil is still on a very high madrega, very high madrega. So the question is still, how can it be melubash in kalim? In the emes, hare esesvis is the oirois, heim beginis pshitus lagabe esesvis the kalim. Moshe's Balak, Perik Yudalit. The Esespheres in the oil, the Esespheres Agnuza is which we're talking about now, at least according to this Shita, are Bechinas Pshitus, and therefore, Lagabe the Kalim, and the Kalim is Bechinas Yesh. How does the Pshitus of the oil come into the Kalim? He's going to explain. Mikol Makoim, Ma'ach Sheshor Sham, Shegam Beshor Sham Makoiram. Nevertheless, because in the Shor Sham Makor, Yesh Bechinas Esespheres, in the shorish of the Mako, in the Esespheres Agnuzos, there's Esespheres Agnuzos. In other words, there is a Epsan Indian of Akbola, there's a tzir in the oil. The Ime Yosh, Haimekins Pshitus, that even though it's Pshitus, Mitzara Dveikus, because the or is Davuk in its Makor, Haor Huma'en Hamaor, it's Davuk. Umitzadi Iskalu Shalahem, or in Sof Baruch Hu, because of the Iskalus of the or in Sof, Moshes Ba'al Perikhof Aleph. Afal P that it's bechinas the dveikus in the or, nevertheless it's still the in of esespheres. And again, the emotional perhaps to understand this is like the in the Mishnah, like the Gemara. All the sphoras that you find in the Gemara are taken from diukim in the Mishnah, right? In the Mishnah, you don't see all these sphoras that took the Chachamim to show them to us, but they're nevertheless there implicitly. The same thing is with the or. The Esa oiras that come out later on were implicit in the Mishnah in the Or Sof. Alpha they're implicit as Eser Spheros. Alpha P that they weren't Nikar and so on. nevertheless, they were there. And therefore, the or has opposite siyu to it, and therefore it can be malubish in the kli, as we'll see. And after they're nimshach by way of the tzimtzum, in other words, the second tzimtzum that we're talking about, the bechinas svirois pratiois bifnei atzmam, harinase kol or bechinas metzius nikeres al kopanim. What happens is that the or now becomes a metzius nikeres. It's a recognizable or, just like after the or, the light goes through, the white light goes through a prism. Now you can see green, and you can see blue, and you can see red, and so on and so forth. It's a metzius nikeres. And therefore, since the Metzius Nikeres, Haru Be'erech Lislabish Islabish Bebeknis Kalim, it can be Malubash in a Kli. Kaman Perish Perek, whatever it is, Yispair or Sibalaze, where he will explain another reason. He will explain another reason for that. And basically, the reason that he explains later on is as follows. It's in Perek Kuftes Zayin, and he explains as follows: that there's a similarity of the Kli. I'll just read it out. This is what he says. Yesh dugma b'hakli, shu kamo ha'or. There's an aspect of the Kli that's like the or. What's that? The pnimius hakli. The mishum zeh hu kli lekabalas ha'or. That's why it's a Kli, to makabel or. And similarly, there's an aspect in the or that is like the Kli. So he gives an example of that, like the behirus of the eye. The eye is an Indian bahir. It's a chomer bahir, and therefore it can receive the light that comes into it. All right, so that's the pnimius akli. So again, the what he explains later on is, since there's an Indian of oir in the kli, which is called pnimius akli, therefore the kli is able to makabel the oir. Similarly, he explains over there, or later in another parak later on, or just after that, that there's an Indian of kli in the oir, which is the chitonius or the or that's shaykh to the oilemis. And therefore, mitzad the chitonius or and the pnimis kli, there can be melubash one in the other. The or can be melubash in the kli. Okay. So again, he's now going to explain the inyan of what happens when there's islapshus or bekalim. All day islapshus bekalim, when the or becomes melubash in the kli, shubuchinis islapshus with tvisa, it's grasp in the kli. In other words, the kli makes some kind of shinui in the or. It actually grabs it and it changes in some way or another. Therefore, nasa or bechinas metzius davar, the or itself becomes a metzius. What does it mean becomes a mitzius? No, we don't mean it becomes like a hot dog or something, right? It becomes it's a bechina in or. It becomes a recognizable aspect of or. Bechinas or a chochma, or a chesed, or whatever particular madrega of or we are talking about. That's what the tfisa is. It becomes the or of chochma because the kli is the kli of chochma. It becomes the or of chesed because the or is the kli is a kli of chesed. Now, he says it here, kafi muhusa kelim, according to the muhusa the kli. Now, we must make a mistake here. We can't make a mistake over here and think like the Ramak thought. What the Ramak's shita was that all the oil is the same oil, and it's only the kli that gives the oil its nature. So he said, the moshel that he used was like this, that all the water is the same water, but when you put the water in a red kli, it looks red, in a blue kli, it looks blue, a green kli looks green, etc. We're not saying that over here because we're talking about that there was already a tzir in the or before the tzimtzum, right? It's like nuzois. So we're not talking about it from that point of view that that the or was completely bepshitus, and it's only the kli that makes the hagbola. No, the or already had its hagbola, and that's why it's able to be malubish in the kli. But the hagbola of the kli causes the or to be nikar as bechinas chokhmah. But nevertheless, the or is the or of chokhmah. Otherwise, it wouldn't be malubish in the kli of chokhmah. The or of chesed is the or that's malubish in the kli of chesed is an or of chesed. So in other words, there's a hagbola in the or and a hagbola in the kli, and the hagbola in the kli causes that particularly in the or to be misgale. Okay? והנה בדרך כלל יש גימל מדרגס באוירס. In general, there are three madrigas in the oiros. Now, in this parak, he's only going to discuss two of them, and the next parak he discusses the third one. But here he's going to discuss two. Let's start with the first one, Madrega Aleph. Madrega Aleph, Heina oiros kmo including Boren Sof Boruchu. Lifnei Hatzimtzum. Now, again, we're still talking about in the Or Hashayach La'olamis. We're not talking about in the Etzema or in the Or Shabegilu La'atzmoi. We're only talking about the Or Hashayach La'olamis. And therefore, he uses the expression oirois in the plural, right? So we're talking about an Inyan where there's already Hagbola in the Or. Masha Enka in the Or Etzema or is not Mukbal, and so on. So there's Gil Madregas in the Or, Madrega Aleph, who are oirois, Kmosha, including Bor and Sof Baruch Hu. Livnei Hatzimtum. That we know is the Eses Frisak Gnuzis. Okay, so that's the first Madrega of the Or, is the Eses Frisak Gnuzis. Shalzeh Omar, regarding this, it says in the in Pasach Eliyahu, Antu Chad v'lo b'chushban. You are one without any cheshbon. Antu Chad v'lo b'chushban. In other words, we can't see the oiros are not yet distinguished into 10, even though we know that they're 10 there, but nevertheless they be achtus and be arvus, and we can't distinguish them yet. That requires the second symptom to be able to do that. Shalzen Omar antu chad v'lo b'chushban. You're not calculable. The pirush chad hu bechinas yochid be'etzem shemiyuchadim mamash b'orein sof. V'gama es spheres atman hem betachas hayichud. The spheres amongst themselves are betachas hayichud, and then is yached with a makor, with the orein sof. So that's the bechina of yachid. He's also going to explain this is yachid, echad, and kadmoin. What we explained is that there's three madregas in the oir, and the first madrega in the oir, again, this is the Lashonis of the Mitler Rebbe, essentially, in Shara Yichud. The first madrega in the oir that he's talking about now is the madrega of Yichud, right? The madrega called I'm sorry, not Yichud, Yochid. Yochid, Echad, and Kadmoin, right? So this is the madrega of Yochid. Uleel perkov dan nisbad ba'alas haratzoin hu bechinas shemois loshen rabbi. So what we explained before in that parak 28-24 is that we said there's the shame hamayuchad, there's one shame, and that shame is ani havaya hushbi, is completis achtus with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then there's shemois in the plural. Now these shemois in the plural are nevertheless behis achtus with HaKadosh Baruch Hu livnei hatzimtzum. V'ina zeu v'madregas the oren so shelivnei hatzimtzum. V'amar shekazo b'shar hayichud perek yud aleph b'inyan yachid echad v'kadmoin. As I just mentioned, the yachid hu etzem ha'or she'enu b'chinas gilu yadayim ve'echad hu hagilu b'chinas klaus b'chinas pshitus v'kadmoin hu ha'shora b'koyach. So now he relates it to what the Mittler Rebbe says over there, that that the madrega that we're talking about over here, when we're talking about the Ezer series like Nuzois, is the madrega essentially of Kadmoin. The madrega of Yochid would be the Etzem Or. Madrega of Echad is Ha'or Shebegilul Atzmoi, and Kadmoin is the Hashora B'Koyach or the Ezer series like Nuzois. Now that has been explained in different ways as well on lower madregas, the inner Yachid Echad V'Kadmon, but that's how he explains it in Shara Yichud. In any event, let's go a little bit further. The Echad V'Kadmoin, as opposed to Yachid, the Echad V'Kadmoin Zeu Kodem Al Saratzoin. They both occur before. Echad occurs before Alus Haratzoin. In other words, the inyan of Echad is before Alus Haratzoin. It's still before the Tzimtzum. But nevertheless, it's before Alus Haratzoin. And Bechinas Alus Haratzoin is the Madrega of Kadmoin. That's called the Madrega of Kadmoin. It's an Or HaShaykh La'olemis. It's Alus Haratzoin, the Eses Rizak Nuzois. All of these terms are more or less interchangeable. Alos haratzoin for oilam, that would be a certain kind of oilam. In other words, or hashayach oilamis. That's where the alos haratzoin takes place, or in the or hashayach oilamis. Mosh kazu matmacher. Aval lagabe ha'oirish nizgalu. But when we're talking about the oiros that were nizgala after the tzimtzum and so on, achar tzimtzum, hinei shorsha ha'oiros zeh bechinas hashora hanol, כמו שסבור בפרק חוב זין, הכלולים בעצמוסי יסבורך שלא נסגלו עדיין, that's again the Esesfirus הגנוזויס, הרי זה בכינוס יוחיד שעל זה נאמר אנטו חד חולו. Okay, so it gets a little bit complicated here because he seems to be contradicting himself. He's just looking at it from the point of view of the macro point of view and the micro point of view, you could say, right? The macro point of view is as Echad is, Yochid is Bechinus Etzema Or, Echad is Or Shabegilu La'atzmoi, Kadmoin is the Or Hashayach Lo'elamis. Okay, those are the madregas in the Or. However, here he's talking about using the same kind of structure to explain just the or, the lowest madrega in the or before the tzimtzum. In terms of the oiros that were mizgala after the tzimtzum, let's just read it again, and I think it'll become clear. Aval lagabai oiros shenizgalu la'achar tzimtzum, in other words, the oiros of atzilus, afilu maybe the oiros of ak, but for sure the oiros of atzilus. Hina shorsha ha'oiros. The Shorsha Oirois, Haklulim Ba'atzmusi, skip this for a minute. Haklulim Ba'atzmusi is Borek, Shalon is Galu Adayin, that haven't yet been revealed. Harazeh Bechinas Yachid Shalzeh Nemar Antuchad. So in other words, we're taking the same madregas that we spoke about before, Yachid, Echad, and Kadmoin, and we're now positing all of those madregas in the Bechina of Kadmoin. Before before the oiros were misgale, that would be called yochid, antuchad. In Kadmon itself, before the hisgalas of the oiros. Why? Because we're talking about the inyan of, we're talking about it in a relative sense, lagabe the oiros that were misgale after the tzimtzum. So therefore, everything before the tzimtzum could also be divided into Yachid, Echad, and Kadmoin. And the oiros before that were Mizgale, before Alos HaRatzoin, when they were Bechinas Esesfirus HaGnuzois, but in Meyuchad with the or itself, that would be called Yachid. Then after the Tzimtzum HaRishon, that would be called Bechinas Echad. And then after the Tzimtzum Hasheni, that would be called Bechinas Kadmoin, because they were Kadmoin to the spherois of Spherois Agluyos. Okay, I don't know if that's clear, but if you go over it again, you'll see that that's what he's doing. He's using the same paradigm on a lower scale, so to speak. Okay, so ukmosh kazu b'makom acher hefresh ben echad leyochid the echad who is actus aprotim, that is already protim but they're bechinas actus. Mash enken yochid is no protim. V'hainu mashenase echad la'acher shekvar nizgalu. V'hayu aprotim nivdalim. The protim were, once they became izgala, they were nivdal. Ukshechozrim nichlolin b'mekoiran shem chozrim is achadim. Is Achdus Haprotim Levad, and that's called Bechinas Echad. Right? So there's Yochid and there's Echad. What's Echad? Echad is when there's already Protim, but the Protim now become unified once again. That's Bechinas Echad, and then Kadmoin is an even lower madrega than that. He's going to explain a little bit more this union of Echad. More derech moshel his pashtus koyach hatnua shebiyad lasos ez a malocha. The power of movement in the hand to do a certain type of malacha. When a person rests and is not doing any malacha anymore, what happens to that koyach? The koyach that he was using to do a certain type of malacha, play tennis, whatever he was doing, right? That inyan is still there, but it's there only in state of potential now. A spashus koyach hayad la'atzmusa, and it returns to its original state. Nas b'chinas echad. It becomes unified with his koyach in a potential state. Urak is achtus haprat acharei shekvar nimshach. It's the prat after it's already been nimshach and returns to its original state. V'haya koyach b'fnei atzmo. It came out as a koyach b'fnei atzmo, and then it returns to its state, and that's what the madrega of echad is. In other words, if we look at it, if we look at yochid, echad, and kadmon and lo madrega, echad is his achdus apratim after they've already been revealed. About yochid, that's echad. About yochid, hu shemiyuchan be'etzem, is one at heart in its essence. She'en kan prat kol, there is no prat. Before he does any movement with his hand. In other words, it's bechinas koyach of his nefesh within the nefesh. The hand for sure has this power, has this ability. It's unified with the koyach hayad in the nefesh. It's a koyach of the nefesh, but it's not a bechinas metzias. It's not an independent metzias. It's part of the nefesh. That's madrega of yichud, of yochid. That's what's called yochid, as it is in the nefesh. When it comes out afterwards, and it comes out into certain tua, and then it returns into the nefesh, that will be called echad, because retrospectively it was an individual koyach, which was in his right hand dafka, not his left hand, which was in his right arm and not his leg, and so on and so forth. It was that particular koyach, and it returns to the neshama. So that's bechinas echad when it's not being used. But it's so since it already expressed itself as an individual oyer, an individual koyach, therefore it would be called bechinas echad and not yochid anymore. Yochid as it is in the nefesh before there's any tnuah. So v'chein hu beyichud kol hakoychos. So too with any particular koyach, shem yuchadim be'etzem nefesh, when they're in the etzem nefesh, kodem shemispashtus me'etzem nefesh, before they spread out, that would be called bechinas yochid. But if they spread into a particular action and then return, that would be called echad. Now, I'm not sure what he means in the next in this next little bracket over here. I'm not sure what he's talking about, but let's just read it anyway. Someone who's being taken out to be killed. Everything is included in his nefesh, and it's not mispashed at all. I'm not sure what he means over here. Maybe it means after he's already been killed. Those koiches are there in the nefesh, and the nefesh is not killed by the process of killing the goof. And these inyonim are ba'achtus in the nefesh. Maybe that's what he means. I'm not sure. I haven't seen this moshel brought elsewhere, but Al-Kopani. And so too with Eses Spheres we can understand it as well. These Eses Spheres have klulim ba'atzmus ha'ma'atzil b'chinas yichud. Bli shum mitzius la'atzman klal chulu. At some stage they're included in a madrega, which is the inyan of yochid. Even though we're talking about Eses Spheres agnuzois, which is an or hashayach la'olemis. But at that stage, you could call it, you could use the same paradigm that we used on the macro scale, you can use on the micro scale before they are, before these accessories like gnuzois are, are described or prescribed individually when they're klulim ba'atzmus. Then the bechinas yichud bli shum metzius la'atzman, and that what would be called yochid of the Eses Spheres Agnuzos. V'zeu antu chad bechinas yichud yochid be'etzem chulu. Ze shekaz of lo bechushban. There's no cheshbon of the spheroids at that point in time. Pirush agam sheklulim boy kol Eses Spheroids einam becheshbon bechushban. Cheshbon, same thing. Because they're in a state of complete bittul and Orein Sof. Therefore, you cannot distinguish them as 10 spheres. The 10 spheres are gnuzos. And one sphere is completely me'urav, is mixed in with the other, so that you can't distinguish this is chokhmah and that's chesed, and so on and so forth. When a shaykh loymar sham cheshbon eser spheres, you can't say eser. So that's the first, the highest madrega, afilu in the eser spheres agnuzois, right? The eser spheres k'moshaim klulim b'makoyra. The madrega base of the eser spheres, who I'm sure is his galus or iris. I'm sorry, the madrega base of the iris. We said the first madrega, there's three madregas in the iris. The first madrega was the Indian of Yochid. The second madrega we're now going to talk about is Echad in the klalustika sense. And then later on, we'll talk about the third, which is Kadmoin. We'll talk about that in the next parak. A madrega base in the oiros, as we said again, there's three madregas in the oir. A madrega base, who am shochas with galus oiros, la'achar tzimtum, shena froshes or orin sof amatzil. This is the separation of the orin sof from the matzil. In other words, afal that it's ha'ora from orin sof. Nevertheless, it's only ha'ora, and therefore it's a second madrega already. The inyan of the oil that we spoke about in Aleph, that was taka oil. It wasn't ha'ora. But now we're talking about the inyan of ha'ora. La'achar tzimtzum hein afroshes ha'ora me'orein sof matzil v'hu hamshochasam b'bchinas spherois pratios. Now we get to the inyan of spherois pratios, in other words, the inyan of eses spherois. Shalzeh Omar, that regarding this, it says in Pasuk Eliyahu, eses spherois blima. These are 10 spheroids that don't have a blima, they don't have a describable mahus. Shehem bli mahus adain. There's no, you can't define them, that have no definition as such. Meaning to say that these are oirois as oirois, and therefore, but not before they become a lubish in kalim, before being coming to his lapshus. Shall they Omar Esas Willis bli Mashem bli Mahusadain, Wahanu the Konomis Lapshusam Bekalim. And therefore, Haim Bechinis Pshitus Adain. They're still in a state of Pshitus before they become Malubish in the Kalim. It's only when they become Malubish in the Kalim that they come out of a state of Pshitus, because the Chitonis are always Malubish and the Pnimis are clear and so on. The Ma'achasha Tzimtzum is mute lavad, since it's only a mute, it's a reduction. It's only a beam of light coming through one small window, as opposed to the light that there is outside. It's only one beam of light coming through a window. This light is still the same light as it was before, and therefore it's called Gilu HaHelem. It's what was Behelem initially is now Begiloi. Giloi HaHelem Mishorsham Mekoiram. HaMekoiram Bechinis Chad. The marker is called Chad V'lo B'chushban, but an unknowable, with no cheshbon to it. No, you can't calculate the various madregas within the or of the spheroids within the or. Kanal al kain gama oirish about galus yesh bahim is garbus makoiram, and therefore, even though this or is bizgalus, it's bizgalus by virtue of its makor, and the makor is predominant in it. In other words, because it's davuk to its makor, it takes on the qualities of the makor, and therefore it's bli cheshbon, below chushban, below bechushban. She'enu b'chinas metzius, b'chinas ischalkus adayin, they are not in a state of ischalkus. V'kamaimer antu chakim v'lo b'chochma yediyah. You are bechinas chochem, but not with a chochma that can be known. In other words, not a chochma that can be defined. It's not a chochma that's bechinas gvul, but a chochma bechinas bli gvul. The chachim shaykh loymar al or. It's possible to call the or chachim. In other words, again, not like the Ramak. The Ramak said that the or is all the same or, and it goes into different kalim, and that's how it gets its quality of chokhmah, its quality of bina, etc., etc. Masha. And here we're saying that there is ischalkus in the or, but the ischalkus is such that it's on a very high madrega. But nevertheless, we could say that this Indian or is chokhmah sheba or, and that Indian or is bina sheba or, and therefore this goes into kli chokhmah, and that goes into kli bina, as he'll explain. The chachim shaykh loyma hala or kshebabi his galus tafka. There you can't call it chakim because it's all one or, as we said before the second tzimtzum. Kmosh Boil means Boil El, Perikutesh, and the carrots clouds not recognizable until it goes through the second symptom. Baraksha or Babi Skalus, only when it comes into recognition, when it comes into revelation, via the second symptom, Shaykh Loimer Hakim, then we can say Hakim. But nevertheless, even though it's called Hakim, it's still a Chochma below B'chinas Yediyah, right? Aval lo b'chochma Yediyah, it's still not a knowable Chochma. We know that it is Chochma, but the type of Chochma it is, we can't know. The Chochma Ilah Batzilus is a knowable Chochma. Masha Enka, and this Chochma is lo b'chochma Yediyah. Chochma Ilah Atzilus is Chochma Yediyah. This is Chochma below Yediyah. In other words, Chochma Vak, or Chochma in Keser. כי החוכמה היא בכנס פשיטוס עדיין, כמו שזה בעולם, פרק י"ד, בעניין חוכמה סתימו. חוכמה סתימו זה חוכמה שבקסר, חוכמה ועריך. שזהו למעלה מהחוכמה עדיין, גם לגבי בכנס חוכמה היא לא עד האצילוס. It's still called חוכמה, but it's nevertheless למעלה מחוכמה ואצילוס. It's חוכמה, even חוכמה היא לא עד האצילוס. It's called חוכמה סתימו because it cannot be defined, it's b'chinas pshitus still. Not only the Or of Chochma, but the Or of Bina, the Or of Chesed, the Or of Gevura, etc., etc. That is the state, a state of pshitus before they come into the kalim of Atzilus. They're still only b'chinas oir. Okay, Kitzer. Here it's a Shorsha Oiris, since the Shorish of the Oiris is the Espiritus Agnuzois, or the Atimtum Ba Oiris Bechinis is Chalkos Bechinis mute. Therefore, the Oiris come out into his Chalkos and as into a reduction of the Oir. That's the union of this particular symptom, the second symptom. While can be a Choltam, she's Labshu, Bekalim, Datzilu, Shain Elokus, therefore they can be melumash in the kalim of Atzilus, which are elokus, because our question was, how can they be melumash? And the answer is, they come out into an inyan of Yischalkus of Oiris. Bislapshusan harim koifen kalim. But when they're melumash in the kli, in the kalim of Atzilus, they like to take on the manner in which the kli operates affects the oir as well. V'yesh ba'oiris, and now we're going, taking a step back. Yesh ba'oiris, gimel madregas, there's 3 madregas in the oir. Ha'alef, shorsha oir is included in the Orin Sof. Korma tzimtzum, there's the first madrega of Oris as included in the Orin Sof prior to the tzimtzum, prior to any tzimtzum, shal zeh ne'emar antuchad. Regarding that, it says antuchad. The imi yoisam eser, ham b'chinas chad mamish. Nevertheless, they're still even though there's eser spheroids, it's b'chinas chad. It's b'chinas chad legabe what? Not legabe atzmus, but legabe ha'oris hamizgalim. It's b'chinas chad. So again, that same Yachid Echad and Kadmoin, which refers to the Etzema or Shabagilu La'atzmoy or Shaykh Lo'ilemis, which is Yachid Echad and Kadmoin in the macro sense, we'll now take that in the micro sense in the Or Shaykh Lo'ilemis. There's Bechina of Yachid, Bechina of Echad, Bechina of Kadmoin. We just described Yachid of the Or Hashayich Lo'ilemis as Oris Aklulim Be'orein Sof, before the Tzimtzum, before the second Tzimtzum, right? That's called Chad, and it's called Chad Legabe, what will be later on. Habais, the second Madrega in the Oir, in the micro Madrega, not the macro. Habais is Galus Oiris Mishor Sham, is when they're actually coming to Giloi, Liyoy Shahem Bechinas Giloi Helem. That's the Inum Giloi Helem. Hagam Shahem Bechinas mute. Nevertheless, it's called, these are still called Bechinas Pshitus, even though there is a Bechina of Helem. These would be the Eser Spherois as they are in Keser, or Yesh Loimer, the Eser Spherois the way they are in Ak. Bechinas Pshitus. While Ze Nemar, Eser Spherois Blima. The Spherois of Blima, in other words, they don't have a Mahus. Chachim v'lo b'chochma Yediyah. But when they come to Atzilus, then it's called Chochma Yediyah. Okay. We'll stop here. I hope there's not too many questions. Are we good? Okay, I think we'll stop here and leave it at that. Good night.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.